Good afternoon, everyone. I am Allie Schulman, and I'm the Manager of Marketing and Communications here at the SFIA. Thank you all for joining us for our second webinar of our Indoor Team Sports Series. For those of you who were not with us on Tuesday, we had Dr. Bill Roberts, Dr. Laura DeFina, and Jason Clement addressing the severity of this subject, both for youth inactivity as well as the rampant spread of COVID-19 and protecting youth athletes and families. While the return to play for youth sports has been quite difficult all across the country, many schools and leagues were able to host fall sports. However, most fall sports are outside. Now that we are heading into our first winter sports season during the pandemic, with cold weather gripping most of the country, team sports move inside. We've all heard that being outside decreases risk and to avoid indoor enclosed spaces as much as possible. Between that and social distancing recommendations, it has been difficult to create safe opportunities for competition. With that being said, many leagues and organizations have been able to do so, and many winter sports across the country will resume in the coming weeks. Today, we have Dr. Carissa Niehoff, Executive Director of the National Federation of State High School Associations, or as many of you know it, the NFHS. And as many of you know, Carissa is arguably the hottest commodity in the space of youth sports right now. Behind professional and college sports, both of which have extensive means and resources to accommodate COVID guidelines, high school sports are the most representative of all youth sports' ability to return to play. Carissa has been heavily involved in these discussions since the beginning of the pandemic and provides expertise for all aspects of high school sports. We also have Jamie Davis, CEO and President of USA Volleyball. In his role, Jamie has been overseeing the return of volleyball games and tournaments for youth leagues across the country. Volleyball, while it is indoors, is not contact and therefore provides a different perspective to the team sports conversation. Last but not least, we have Omar Mitchell, Vice President of Sustainable Infrastructure and Growth Initiatives at the NHL. Omar has spent the last several months building up the conversation around new ways to participate in the sport of hockey, hone skills, and stay active that do not require close contact or close proximity to others. While the NHL did host their 2020 season, Omar provides a unique perspective, encouraging young players to stay in the game, even if traditional play is not an option right now. We are excited and honored to have these leading authorities on the three major team sports with us today. After our conversation, we will reserve the last 15 minutes for questions from the audience. We encourage you to send in your questions using the question bar on your screen throughout the discussion, and we will address all questions after the conversation. Now, to start, I'm going to ask each of you to provide a brief overview of your perspective on your sport during COVID. Carissa, let's start with you. While I know you can speak to all sports, we'd love if you could specifically address basketball for the sake of this conversation, as it's one of the most participated in youth sports in America.
Well, sure, and welcome to everyone who's participating, and I hope that you all are well and your families are well. In the sport of basketball, what we're seeing nationally is a real mosaic. The NFHS Sports Med Advisory Committee has dubbed basketball to be one of the moderately risky sports when it comes to potential COVID transmission. That being said, as we head back indoors into gymnasiums where there may be fans allowed, certainly we're going to be watching, doing everything we can to provide guidance on precautions that can be taken, looking at how facilities can be maintained, and certainly how to address fans and families. Right now, across our state associations nationally, we have 24 of our 51 associations that are intending to actually start their basketball seasons on time. We have another 18 that will be modifying their season in some form or fashion. And then we have another 9 associations that are still to be determined. So what we can see is that a good chunk of our state associations are really trying to move forward with basketball as the winter season is upon us, and some are already practicing.
Thank you, Carissa. And Jamie, we'll go to you next.
Great. Well, thanks for everyone for the time. And like Carissa said, I really hope everyone is staying safe and healthy this process. So I want to explain a little bit about what happened in our schedule and the timing of how it has impacted USA Volleyball and our clubs and our tournaments that have gone on. When COVID hit in March, and became the real announced as the pandemic, that was actually the heart of our season. We have our qualifiers and our national championships that all take place between about March and July. And instantly at that point, we had to figure out what to do when this happened. So the first thing we actually did was we actually stopped sanctioning everything and put a pause on all activity because we were all figuring this out for the first time. And in that period of time, what we did was we then we put together a return to play task force, and that was done in concert with CDC, with the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, with other national governing bodies, and also our board of directors as well. And we have our own medical commission to come out and try to come up with a plan of how to do this. Because when we first looked at it, we realized that one size did not fit all across the country. At that time, it was the Northeast that was actually the hot spot, and really it was fine in the South and in the West. And then we've watched this morph. And so we were trying to figure out how to come up with a policy and a plan that didn't bring everyone down to the lowest common denominator, so that if there was one hotspot that the entire country had to go down to that level. So we came out with that policy, and we have that published on our website on usavolleyball.org, and it's there and it's updated from time to time. We have a whole information hub there as well on not only the return to play guidelines, but also on safety measures and updating everyone on what was happening. Because these events, we started first postponing them, and then eventually, unfortunately, we did have to cancel all of those events. Now we have a new membership season that started on September 1st this past year, and it goes September 1st to August 31st. And we're quite pleasantly surprised that right now our membership year on year is only down 7% compared to where it was, which we were racing for a much bigger hit, which is really showing the demand for these young athletes to wanting to compete and wanting to play as well. And so that's really been the impact that it's had on us. On the national team side, all of the international calendar was canceled, of course, including the Olympic Games, which have then been postponed until next summer as well. So we really had a tough summer going through here, trying to train with extreme protective gear and limited one-on-one interaction with our athletes, and trying to keep them in shape and keep them healthy during this time. But we really had no semblance of a year of being able to practice and play at all like we normally would have.
Thank you. Now, Omar.
So first of all, thank you for having us, the NHL, join this conversation, and I agree. I hope everyone is keeping safe. So I'm going to answer it in two ways. The first is what we did at the NHL level, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I've been seeing in the youth hockey space. So at the NHL, obviously, for those folks who weren't following, March 13th or the beginning of March, when we literally paused our play, our 2019-2020 season, and we paused our play until we were sure enough that we were ready to get back into a situation and an environment where we kept our athletes safe, our staff safe. And the way that we did that was we created hub cities, both in Toronto and in Edmonton, to finish up the remainder of our season, to play our playoffs and ultimately our Stanley Cup final. And that started towards the end of July, beginning of August, under very strict protocols that were developed by our league, those of which are found on our NHL.com website. And it was it was a very successful tournament and a successful return to play, primarily because of all of the things that we enacted in these bubble cities. They were complete locked environments. In other words, our players went in, our officials and staff went in, and nobody left. And I'm happy to report, and as we know in the press, that there were 0 cases within the hub cities in Toronto and Edmonton. And that was a testament to everybody making sure that they followed the regulations, they followed the rules, and they did what they were supposed to do. And we awarded our Stanley Cup at the end of September. That is a testament to both the commissioner and our executive leadership, because they waited pretty much until the last minute to decide what made the most sense from a health and safety perspective, right? And it was a testament to our Players Association and our players really trying and taking that agenda and following the rules and regulations. When it comes, we're very happy that it happened. When it comes to youth hockey, we saw a lot of the same type of mirroring happening at the pro level, which is a lot of rinks obviously closed down in the months of March to April and May. And what we started seeing were things like our governing bodies, USA Hockey, US Figure Skating, put out guidelines on returning to the rink. And those were very, very carefully laid out plans that showed how rink operators should be thinking about returning to their facilities. And over the past summer and into the fall, we're seeing the industry open up their facilities under modified or regulated schedules based on their local jurisdictions, based on their local hockey associations guidelines, both from a programming standpoint as well as from a facility operations standpoint. You got to think about how the program operates and what the procedures are there. And we have to think about what are the rules and regulations. We'll get into some of those. Obviously, the last thing I'll finish up by saying is that you're seeing a lot of states that are closing down or saying that that they are not allowing ice hockey to be played. We saw that in Massachusetts, and I think as recently as this morning, we heard about some states in the Northeast that are closing down there or not allowing certain types of ice hockey. So this is a fluid environment. It's one that we're seeing that a lot of the industry has to react to in real time. And I can share some of the details of how we can go as an industry to mitigate some of those concerns.
Thank you so much. So our next question, if you could each explain or talk more about the biggest challenge for participation for basketball, volleyball, and hockey during a time when COVID is at its highest point in the US. Omar, could you start with this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly we know that if we just look at our facilities, we are playing indoors in a cold environment, typically that in facilities that have to modulate relative humidity. Our facilities in these indoor arenas, particularly at the community rink level, are much more, definitely we think about those concerns when we think about viral transmission. I'm not a scientist and I'm not a medical expert. I think we heard that in the call on Tuesday, and we got some really key learnings on that. What we've learned is that airborne transmission, is particularly in these types of environments, is something that we need to be concerned about. And so what we are seeing are things like how do we mitigate viral transmission through things like HVAC upgrades and mechanical system upgrades and those types of things to mitigate that risk, because we know that community rinks are already doing a lot of good best practices when it comes to getting people on the ice. We know that they're doing really things about control within their facilities, making sure that there is density control, that they're keeping social distancing, some of these best practices. So I think the key point right now, as the pandemic is really starting to flare up, is ensuring that the rules and regulations are in place in our local communities and our local community rinks. And I say that because there's been a lot of best practice sharing, and that is a testament to the industry coming together and recognizing that we are better when we stand together and to address this head on, rather than trying to develop our own protocol willy-nilly. So we're seeing that. And I think now the next step is enforcement, whether it's through supervisors or through folks in the facility to usher people off the ice, to get family members to stay in particular locations, to ensure that youth are complying with the rule protocols in the facility. Because I'll end by saying this, when you really kind of break it down, and I hate to kind of extrapolate it down to its essence, because these facilities, our community rinks, are adopting such good best practices, it's not the facility itself that's getting COVID. It's really the folks that come into the facility, whether they're coming in by travel teams or in car pools, or if they're congregating in parking lots to dress. Those are the situations that are more geared towards getting more viral transmission. And so I think that a lot of education is a key point of that.
Thank you, Omar. Carissa, will you go next?
Sure. So for the sport of basketball, I think we have both internal and external challenges, and Omar summarized a number of them very well that we would share in basketball. Internally, it's the very nature of the game, the integrity of how the game is played. So you have risk of transmission primarily through respiratory droplets and aerosol, and just the nature of the game itself. And really, a part of the concern is the unknown. We just don't have baseline data to indicate what the real level of risk is and how much time and proximity we're talking about here. We're learning, but so that's one of the internal challenges, certainly. And Omar referenced the absolute non-negotiable kinds of protocols that we have to take in order to be able to implement our program. So looking at the hygienic practices, the risk mitigation strategies, phasing kids back in with some level of knowledge as to the health and wellness on a daily basis of our kids, our coaches, and our programs. I think externally the challenges lie in community decisions and decisions that we make as individuals. Where do we go and how do we take care of ourselves out there? How do we get to and from events? Do we carpool? So I think if the community takes all of this very seriously and is on board with supporting return to play, we have to all realize that we play a role on this team and we all have responsibility to get kids back. So in addition to just the sport itself, I think the risk mitigation strategies have to be there. When you look at fans and families and facilities, you've got to appreciate the size of your facility, the ventilation, the ability to keep it clean, and looking at some creative kinds of measures as to how the game might even be implemented that you can do that involve social distancing without really compromising how the sport is played. Looking at whether or not you even have concessions. So using some creative thinking, some cautious thinking, but also some common sense. And I think we should be able to, when we are ready and where we are ready, bring kids back in a careful way.
Thank you, Carissa. And Jamie?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Carissa and Omar said, so I don't want to be too repetitive on that. But I would say one of the biggest challenges that we've faced since we've been dealing with this on a daily basis has been the changing guidelines, the changing rules, the changing knowledge, because we're all learning as we go along. So if we remember at the very beginning, they told us not to wear masks. They told us that wasn't necessary. We were told that it was surface and everyone was wearing gloves. Everyone went to the grocery store and suddenly that all changed and we all now needed to be wearing masks. And frankly, they weren't worried about that surface. So we had to constantly be changing as well as we went along. But the biggest challenge we really have is we've come up and we've worked very hard with, as I mentioned, medical doctors, the CDC, the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee to come up with return to play guidelines for the sport of volleyball. And the most challenging part is making sure that people actually adhere to them and do them, because you can put out guidelines all you want, but if people don't wear the mask and they don't adhere to certain guidelines, I'll give you a few examples of ones that we have right now. All of our referees are using hand whistles only, not blowing whistles. In the sport of volleyball, everyone probably knows that you huddle after every single point, win or lose the point. We have said there's no more huddles, no high fives. You typically switch sides in between sets. We've eliminated that unless there is a condition where truly there's, say, sunlight coming in through a window and there is actually a disadvantage to the playing on one side. But in an indoor sport, that rarely is the case, as well. We've removed water stations from any of the things that we're telling people. You have to bring your own water bottle and use those. We're sanitizing balls in between sets. We're sanitizing the courts in between matches. All these different types of things. We've also gone to what's called an R1, one referee instead of we typically have 5. Why? To limit the number of people that are around the court and in the proximity. We've removed player benches and have taped in areas where the players can stay as well, less to sanitize. We have the players everyone has to wear masks unless you're actually on the court. So we're putting in a bunch of procedures, but truly, if people don't adhere to these, we can do as much as we want to try to do that, but the risks aren't being mitigated to the way that we're trying to have them mitigated.
Thank you so much. Are Our next question is, what practices from pro leagues have you been able to implement to youth leagues to keep them safe, whether they be technical or social policies? Carissa, can you start with this one?
Well, for basketball, I think, first of all, we have to think about the nexus of decision making. And it really, as I said earlier, is a mosaic. So we have to think about the right people, looking at the right kinds of situational evidence. Look around. Where are we? What are our COVID rates? And what are our resources and our demographics? So if the right people are engaged in making the decision, you will have some policy. But really, to Jamie's point about the need to be fluid here, a lot of our decisions really will center on best practices. So some of the policies around risk mitigation strategies for participants and attendees, they can be put in place and they can stand. In terms of the best practices and the sport itself and implementation of the sport, some of the creative measures with how officials operate, how the game might be played. For example, no jump ball, or if there's a free throw or an inbounding of the ball, just have the official bounce the ball to the player inbounding the ball. Limited contact and social distancing from the officials table to the bench and such. All of those kinds of things are best practices. Looking at fans in the stands and some of the expectations there, which have to be put into place from a policy perspective, is non-negotiable. Perhaps you're looking at testing protocols and health and safety protocols that are part of policy. So really, to differentiate policy and practices, I think best practices can be a little more nimble because they may need to change, whereas policy are really things that absolutely we've got to decide, we've got to approve, we have to educate on, and they have to be held in place and respected. So with the sport of basketball, it's in high schools and interscholastic settings, you've got your school administration, athletic administration, your local boards of education, your local health agencies, and of course at the state level, your legislative influence, governors' involvement, your state education and health agencies there. So it's a complex process leading to execution of policy, and then certainly on the ground level, what are the best practices that we have to implement in our particular program?
Thank you, Carissa. Omar?
So I would say that certainly there's a lot of, at the pro level, we're seeing a lot of our venues, and recall, for those folks who don't know, we have 31 NHL clubs, 7 in Canada, of which 7 are in Canada. And what we're seeing is that a lot of these facilities are already very far along in their return or re-entry protocols, i.e., how do we get people, fans, and players back into these facilities in a safe manner? And Carissa, to your point, what we've also been seeing is that some of these pro venues are liaising directly with their local health authority officials to develop guidelines around the protocols for sports as a whole. And perhaps some of those local health authority guidance that's happening at the pro level might come down to the community, it might inform some of the community rink decision making that needs to happen in terms of policies and regulations. So that's one thing that I'm seeing. The other thing I'm seeing is that obviously there's a very, very important distinction between pro NHL rinks, pro ice arenas, and community rinks. Obviously, community rinks don't have as much resources. They don't have as much access to dollars or human capital to really take in some of those best practices. But what the pro rinks do is that they are able to test out the viability of some of these technologies, products, and services that are going to be COVID mitigation technologies, products, and services. And so we're seeing that a lot of, I can't even tell you how many vendors have come and said to us and to our industry, we've got the next best thing to mitigate COVID. And so a lot of the pros are using their resources to test out some of those technologies to prove out whether they are viable or not. And those key learnings are what's coming down to the community rink level, because obviously they are financially resource strapped. And at the end of the day, those community rinks are the ones that have to make a decision on, with limited budget or no revenues, how do we maintain our business, whether they are municipally owned or whether they're privately owned. And so it's imperative that the industry really shares those best practices so that the rinks know what they can use. And we're seeing that with things like electrostatic sprayers. We're seeing things like, as an example, the way of using UVGI, ultraviolet germicidal irradiation lights. We're seeing how the pros are thinking about air filtration systems and MERV rated filters, and how those things can be applied down to the community rink level. We're even seeing technical engineering things like air exchanges within the facility. All of these things that the pros are exploring are things that are going to be very relevant to community rinks. And that's the benefit of the industry kind of sharing those best practices. And that's what I'm optimistic about, because those key learnings are key to the success of youth coming back to our rinks.
Thank you, Omar. Now, Jamie?
I would say that we haven't looked as much into the pros as we have to other resources on that side, largely because A, we don't have professional volleyball in the United States. That's number one. And number two, a lot of the good practices that the pros have done, and I give them a lot of credit for getting their seasons back up and running, are often related to these big arenas and the fans in the stand and all that, which is not really what our model is or what it is at the youth level. A typical event for us is taking over a facility that might have 4 to 8 courts, or in the big championships, maybe it's 80 courts in a convention center or something like that, but it's not the big stands and that. So we've actually used different resources than probably the pros as our benchmark. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee has been a wonderful resource through the entire process. We were having weekly, sometimes at the very beginning, 3 times a week calls with each of the national governing bodies and the U.S. Olympic Paralympic Committee, for us to all be sharing best practices and also learning from them of what they're hearing. We have our own medical commission. There's also a guy named Dr. Jonathan Finoff over at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee who's in charge of all medical there, and he was giving us the updates. We were then also talking to our international federation, which in the sport of volleyball is called the FIVB, Federation International of Volleyball, about what we're seeing in different parts of the world. And where, remember, the outbreak was first in China, and it broke out in Europe faster and things like that as well. So we were trying to get information from them that we could then implement on our side instead of necessarily from the pros.
Makes sense. Thank you. Our next question, Omar, you just briefly touched on this, but I know that this is going to be an issue for everybody. Under new COVID guidelines and regulations, how will this affect spending? Do youth leagues and school teams have the resources to comply to the safest measures? What are the most costly protocols that have been put in place? Omar,
yeah, so I can't speak too much to the youth leagues and whatnot, but I can talk about, we think about community rinks, right? We know that in ice hockey, infrastructure is one of the key components of our game, and we need to, and so just getting folks back into rinks, making them feel comfortable, is one of the key drivers of that. And so I mentioned some of those technology barriers, or excuse me, the key technologies, products, and services that would mitigate COVID from, let's say, mechanical and HVAC systems. But I think that there's also things to be said about the fact that some community rinks may not be able to, literally pay for all of those enhancements. And so I think it goes back a lot to how do we use the resources that are available to ensure education, to ensure that people know what they are to do when they come into the facilities, and to ensure that they can keep compliance to those programs, those practices. Carissa, you mentioned it. Some of our programs that are deployed by our clubs right now that are targeting youth, they are provided so that they are played 4-on-4 rather than just regular play, to mitigate or to reduce the amount of interaction that kids have. Sometimes the programs are built so that they're structured so that they are reducing contact where possible and making sure that they're social distance. And again, it's all about educating around those concerns. I think that that's the key point, because a lot of some of these big ticket items, when it comes to mechanical systems or mitigation technologies, products and services like electrostatic sprayers or ozone temporary portable cleaning units, they cost a lot of money. And so I think we have to go back and say, we want to make sure that we're keeping these safe environments. Here are our protocols. We need to communicate it effectively, and we need to educate folks on what they need to do so that they can safely come in, participate, and come out of our facilities.
Thank you, Omar. Jamie, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think you've hit the nail on the head of what is going to be a very, very big and major issue across the country is the cost of what this is implied here. I can tell you that we're in the process right now of doing our budgeting for 2021, and we have added $450,000 in the budget just for COVID-related extra expenses that we have on our 5 championship events. So for 5 events alone, it's nearly $100,000 each event. And when you take things like that, when you take that into account, it's things like the sanitization of just the materials that you need, the supplies that you need for sanitization. It's the testing equipment that we're putting in place. It's all of the temperature checking machines and thermometers that you need to use as well. But there's one more thing about that. It's also, I think there's going to be a challenge on availability of it. So it's not, I remember at the very beginning when we first said, okay, you couldn't get your hands on Clorox or anything like that to be able to sanitize them if you had those policies in place. So as Carissa mentioned, there's several sports in high school that are now shifting their fall sports. Volleyball, women's volleyball is the #1 team participatory sport for girls in all of high school. More girls play volleyball than any other team sport. Many states have now suspended their fall season and pushed it to the spring. So now what's going to happen in the spring is you're now going to have, that's when the boys volleyball typically takes place. And high schools usually maybe use the same gym for women's volleyball and boys volleyball. And now suddenly they're going to have to figure out how to do that on top of it while there's basketball seasons, and maybe it's boys and girls basketball all taking place in the same area. Plus, then you have your club going on there as well. So there's going to be a real run on facilities and also I think on supplies as well, you know, on that side. But another thing in our sport, at least that will increase the costs, is when you throw tournaments, we're asking for extra spacing of the courts as well. By doing that, we get less courts in the same amount of space that we had. What does that mean? Less teams can play. And we're also having to we're trying to stagger start times so that not everyone comes at it. We used to call it a first wave when all the teams arrive in the morning. We're trying to stagger it so there's less people, so there's more social distancing as they go along. What does that mean again? Less matches or more costs in being able to do that in your facilities and all that stuff as well. So I think this cost is going to be a very big issue across the country, both at the high school level, at the club level, and even at the pro level.
Thank you, Jamie. Carissa?
Yeah, I would echo everything that Omar and Jamie have said in terms of fiscal cost and accessibility issues. I'll throw in human resources. What we are hearing from our high schools across the country, and it's been across multiple sports, so I would anticipate for basketball, we would be concerned about the same thing, is, you know, what happens when you don't have teachers in your schools, or you don't have coaches on your courts, you don't have bus drivers. And for that matter, if you're trying to socially distance a varsity JV freshman basketball program, how many buses do you need to get them there? Or how are you dealing with some of these transportation issues? We're actually hearing there are official shortages already. So now what happens when we have a shortage of officials? If Jamie's sport is jammed up now come spring with all sorts of volleyball programs happening, where are our officials going to go? So I would just throw in there, in addition to underscoring what they've said financially, for sanitation and accessibility of facilities, we have to pay attention to whether or not our adults have to quarantine. All of the folks that make a program possible are even available to execute programming. So the human resources issue is going to be a challenge as well.
Allie, can I just add on to what Carissa was, if you don't mind? I 100% agree with what she's saying, and when you get to that officials, people who are volleyball officials often are also a basketball referee and also maybe a softball umpire. These people just love to officiate and they're certified in many sports and do that as well. Suddenly all of these sports are going to be coming on top, and there's going to be a huge run on, and I think a shortage of people being officials. The other thing that I want to comment on, and I've worked even with Carissa on this, is working to, and I mentioned those sports that are moving from the fall to the spring, is to ensure that the high schools are going to allow the kids who sometimes during the high school season do not allow them to play club, to relax those rules, to allow the kids to not have to choose between high school play or club play. Because I think what you're doing is two things. One, the kid is the one who's actually losing out. You're actually harming the kid you're making them make a decision. And I think some will choose club and some will choose high school, but I think some of them will want to do both, and on that side as well. So we're looking to try and work with the high school, and that's why I said we've worked with Carissa and her team as well, but with the high school associations to say, let's work together and figure out a schedule on how we can make this work, because of A, not to make the kids have that choice, but B, also because of this human capital issue that's going to be there.
Absolutely. So that kind of brings us to our next question. With COVID reaching record numbers across the U.S., schools and districts have either canceled their winter season or delayed until further notice just in the past couple of days. Would you all speak to this? Who do you think should be responsible for making these decisions? Where should we look for guidance for all levels of youth play? Carissa, if you could start.
Sure, I referenced it a little bit earlier with regard to how we recommend decisions be made in the interscholastic ecosystem. And that is first by taking a look around you, wherever you are, identifying the leaders in both the educational environment, the athletic environment, and certainly the organizations that help to inform decisions that are made at a local level. What are your demographics? Are you in an urban area? Are you rural? What are your COVID numbers? What are your positivity rates? And what resources do you have? And all of these spin into, okay, now let's get the right people at the table to talk about this and talk about education strategies and talk about actual facility maintenance planning and developing the emergency action planning. What is the testing protocol and how do we phase kids in, and who monitors that phase in process? Because we certainly recommend that. So the who would be the leaders across all of those areas of concern for interscholastic sport, education, and athletics. Certainly the health agencies, certainly if you have governor's intervention or executive orders, we have to respect those. But I would suggest that if you're a person who could influence a decision or has some skin in the game, to try to get yourself a seat at the table. So if it's a sport, equipment manufacturing, or anyone in the SFIA industry, to stay in touch with those people that are the decision makers and bring your story to the table as well, because maybe you can help, maybe you can help to inform, and maybe you can get information in a timely manner that can help you make your own business decisions. But it's a whole lot of folks, it's complicated, but really it has to be a collaborative effort. It cannot be one person in one lane making a decision for all. And I think Jamie said this earlier, you could be in a low risk area, a high risk area, but just to say, well, let's run the middle, let's run the median or the average, that's not appropriate. We really do have to pay attention to the reality of your situation on the ground.
Thank you, Carissa. Omar?
I can't add anything more to that. I couldn't agree more with Carissa and her comments. This has to be a collaborative approach, not one size. She hit the nail on the head. All I will say is this, is that I have been impressed through my perch at the league at seeing how community rinks and the rink industry has collaborated on this already. And whether you're a municipally owned facility or a privately owned facility, everybody has been approaching this very collaboratively. And I am excited to see that continue, because we need that type of collaboration to continue to address the next whatever it's the next wave or whatever the next situation is going to be. because absent of that, we are all going to suffer. And so I've been enthusiastic about that, and I encourage that to continue across state lines, across all of the different types of facilities at USA Hockey and Hockey Canada, because that's how we're going to get through this.
Thank you, Omar. Jamie?
I pretty much agree with everything that's been said. I would, I think Carissa just really did, hit the nail on the head. So I don't want to just speak for the sake of speaking, because the one thing I would say, the only thing I would add is that we saw at the beginning there were a lot of decisions being made when we weren't, as a national governing bodies of our sports, having a voice at the table. And we're the ones who are living and breathing it every day. Our membership is made up of athletes. Our membership is made up of coaches. Our membership is made up of parents. Our membership is made up of club directors. These are the people who are on the ground day to day, who are actually physically seeing what's going on here. And sometimes, I do believe everything should be done at the local level. I mentioned that earlier, and I do think that a federal mandate at one level, we said that earlier, one size doesn't fit all. And if not, instead of a median, which Carissa mentioned, I think if you're going to take the uber safe one, you have to go to the lowest common denominator of the most restrictive, which then is in areas where COVID is not there. You're not allowing people to be able to have looser regulations and still remaining safe. But we really, us and myself and about 25 of the other national governing bodies, have really been out there trying to petition to let us have a voice at the table, just to be able to share what we know, because we deal with this on a daily basis. You can ultimately make the decision. We're not the lawmakers. You ultimately can make the decision, but listen to us. We're doing it because we have information from our membership and we want to share it.
Thank you. So on a similar note, but coming from the opposite side of the spectrum, Jason Clement, founder and CEO of Sports Facilities Companies, which is one of the top major sports facilities companies in the country, joined us on our Tuesday webinar. And among all of their major complexes, which have been hosting massive tournaments for the past several months, he stated that their facilities have had over 1 million visitors since May and only 22 reported COVID cases, 13 of which were staff and only 5 of which were youth participants. In addition, USA Football just highlighted a Utah Football League of 6,000 kids playing in an 11-week season, which consisted of about 1,500 total football games and only 30 positive tests throughout their entire season. So what do stats like these mean for your sport and for your leagues? Jamie, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I think that's encouraging data. First of all, that's obviously very encouraging data that with such large scale events that they're having, there's been very few instances that can be directly related to it, is encouraging. I think it really still comes down to is that if people will, it comes down to people. If people will actually take on board the guidelines and the recommendations that are being played, that's how you're going to do this. And I'm assuming in their facilities that people are following those mandates, and that's what's happening. We unfortunately didn't get to host any of our championship events this past year. They all got canceled due to COVID, and that's where we have the big ones. We were able to host our junior national beach championships, and that's outdoor, of course, but we still had 330 teams all there playing volleyball, and we had no instances whatsoever, but people were following our protocols and everything as well.
Thank you.
So, all I would say is that, and I think Jamie, you nailed it, is that it's a data point. It's a good data point to have, because I think that to the point about us getting onto youth sports being a part of the table and educating around these things, there are good proof of concept of these sports in indoor facilities that are working. And that is a very, very salient point. And SFIA, or excuse me, SFA and SFM and their group, they did an excellent job at putting out their reentry protocols. They did an excellent job of educating all the folks that were coming to the facilities. And so it's that type of thinking that we need to bring to the decision makers so that they know. Now, I'm not gonna, there are gonna be instances, let's be real, there are gonna be instances where there are gonna be outbreaks and there are gonna be flare-ups. We saw it in Massachusetts recently in the past 2 weeks where Massachusetts rinks shut down. So there are going to be instances where that happens, but I think overall, the key point is that there needs to be more education around what's working, and that those adoption of those best practices, it's what's going to make our future look better.
Thank you, Omar. Carissa?
I agree with both Jamie and Omar, certainly around the education that's necessary. And the more we can learn about the story that's happening out there, the better. And yes, that example is very encouraging. We're hearing similar stories from our state associations that have now gone through the fall season with whatever sports they've chosen to implement in most state associations. And when you think about across the 51 associations, only 6 of whom at this point had postponed everything until after, well, what they're calling a later winter spring season. That leaves us with 45 state associations and millions of exposures for the 19,500 high schools and the sports. So millions and millions of exposures, which are potential situations with very, very low numbers of COVID positive events or situations. Contact tracing is very difficult. We don't follow kids home from school or from practice, but even with that being a hard thing to do, in the beginning of all of this pandemic, sports were very suspect in terms of what might be a super spreader opportunity. As we started to see things play out with very few reports of cases, and most of those reports being the student came to school with it from someplace else, likely, then we started to suspect that sports were not necessarily going to prove to be the super spreader kinds of situations. And in fact, to get through months already of activity in the interscholastic world, and now to go into winter and seeing youth program stories in basketball where they have been playing youth, being very similar, it's encouraging. Unfortunately, I think we will always be in a caboose situation. We don't have the research ahead of time. We'll have to capture the story as it happens. So unless we're out there, we're not going to know. So we're kind of on the wrong end of this, but we will, at the end of this first experience with this pandemic, hopefully it'll last, we will start to have some data that tells us how we did. And right now we're hearing stories about how we're doing, and it's very encouraging.
Thank you so much. All right, so we have about 12 minutes left for questions. We've already gotten several, so we'll cover as many as we have time for. Carissa, this is a question for you. How well is the COVID course on NFHS going?
Oh, it's exploded. I would have to get the most recent numbers from Dan Schuster in the Learning Center, but within the first 2 weeks of its launch, we had over 100,000 people take it. It's free. It's about 20 minutes long, very informative. I encourage you all to go onto the Learning Center, and that's nfhslearn.com. Check the course out. It's upper, probably close to 5 million at this point that have taken the course.
Amazing. Our next question this I guess is for you too as well. For basketball, do you recommend mandating that athletes wear face masks? Specifically wondering at the youth basketball community and community recreational level.
Our sports medicine advisory committee is not advocating for competitors to wear masks. They advocate for everybody else involved in the program, in the gymnasium or whatever the facility, to be masked, including coaches and players on the bench. And certainly if there are anybody else on the sidelines, wear the mask. But our sports med advisory committee is not advocating for active competitors to wear masks.
Thank you. A lot has been mentioned about how physical issues are being addressed. But what about what mental issues are you finding, and how are you each dealing with any of those which have developed?
I'll start. So we're hearing a lot. I think, first of all, I told you a stat earlier that our membership is down just 7%, given that the membership season started on September 1st, and a lot of play has been even postponed in several states and held. I think that is a direct response directly from the parents and from the kids who are saying, we want to play because we want to get out there from not only a physical side, but also from for the mental stability as well. And I think I just would let statistics talk to that more than, an opinion, that number would show that the being cooped up and not being able to do this. So what we try to do is give those protocols and those guidelines to try and make it as safe as possible to be able to do it. But the demand is definitely there from them to be able to want to do that. And I think a lot of that is not just from physical, but also from a mental standpoint.
Thank you, Jamie. Anybody else want to touch on that?
We're seeing the same. Yeah, we have actually research is emerging in this area probably faster than research around COVID contagion in playing. University of Wisconsin did a terrific study a few months ago that looked at over 3,000 student athletes and self-reported significantly increased rates of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations. We're seeing research emerging. In fact, a number of studies that you can access now that point to the same thing. Without engagement, student athletes, they're not just less physically active, but mentally and emotionally, they're not as healthy. We're even hearing from our state associations that schools are reporting increased rates of suicide, where kids have been sidelined. And just yesterday, this is terribly sad, we're hearing that our Native American reservation populations are really, really being decimated in this area. They are not engaged and they don't have resources and reporting alarmingly high rates of suicide and depression. So it's another pandemic, honestly. It really is something that we have to pay attention to.
And not to just to add to it, it just reinforces in my mind the need of the why youth sport is so important. It's just so critical that we ensure the access from infrastructure and from a programming perspective to underserved communities, right through to well-funded ones. This is as critical as ever. And even from that perspective, I would even say something like, when we think about the NHL and we think about our sport requiring indoor ice, we are also seeing that there are alternative forms of the game so that we can ensure people can come outside and play. So like street hockey as an example is one example where we are seeing a lot more youth that are adopting street hockey, playing outdoors to get that type of relief or that type of addressing that need, because we see how important it is. And one example of that is last year, the NHL developed a technology called a hoop net concept, which is a basketball hoop that has a street hockey net that's all built into one configuration. And it's those types of innovations that'll ensure that folks have the places and spaces so that they can get outside, whether it's outdoors or they don't have to be inside, so that they can address those concerns to mitigate mental health issues. I mean, that is truly something that we all need to be aware of.
Thank you all so much. Our next question, who is helping to bridge the funding gap with community or local sports? Anyone? We can move on to the next question.
I can share. Yeah, I can just share an example, and this would be a credit to the pro level. We have a recent partnership with the NFL, and they have provided some funding to support research and even some staffing to really get into the trends and demographics of the sport of football and looking at developing some strategies to advocate. That's an example of how we could work together, but the funding issue itself on the ground, I mean, if the resources aren't there, unless there are grants, there are other organizations that can step in and help. We're not seeing a consistent type of behavior across the country.
There is one, to build off of that, there's one tangible thing that we've seen in our organization, and this involves a corporate partner of the NHL. A plug, which is around, we just recently announced a partnership with a maintenance, repair, and operations company called Fastenal. And as part of that partnership, so think of them, they're like a Home Depot or a Lowe's, but for B2B company, B2B businesses, and they're our official MRO supplier. But the benefit of having a partnership like that is not just to serve the pros, but it's actually to bring all of those group purchase program. So think of 40% savings on things like PPE or cleaning supplies down to the community rink level. And that's a very tangible way of us working with our corporate partners to really try and drive how we can address those financial dollar concerns in terms of operating costs in those community rinks. And that's one example. There's another example that we did. Again, funding gaps are all shapes and sizes. Remember how we talked about HVAC equipment being one of the things that we would look to mitigate viral transmission. And one of the things that we just launched is announced a partnership with a rink engineering expert to help community rinks determine what their needs are so that they can go using our expert to have to leverage their expertise so that they can go and ask what they can do that's cost effective so that we don't have to put a lot of capital outlay, but they can at least know what are the things that they can do to lower their operating costs. Because at the end of the day, I think that this part of the game is we're not going to be spending so much. We have to figure out how we reduce our operating expenses now. And so those are some of the things that we're doing at the league to try and address that funding gap. Certainly there's more that can be done, but those are tangible things that we at the NHL are doing.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to squeeze in one last question before our time cuts out. In California, we are supposed to learn whether we will be able to safely play high school sports this year. In the sport of volleyball, has NFHS, USAV, or another national organization released any requirements for host sites? Have any rules changed officially at the national level for high school play? No side switching, masks required, etc. For high schools to prepare to host matches indoors, what are the guidelines that you would recommend? And Jamie, I'm going to start with you because I know you have a hard cutoff at 3.
Yeah. So I think Carissa will be much better to tell you about what the actual mandates are at the high school level because of the high school associations on that. However, I would say our return to play guidelines that we have posted, as I mentioned, on usavolleyball.org, is all of the protocols that we would recommend that they take. Those are not meant to be just for club, or those are meant to be for all people who are playing volleyball on that side. So I would say that we have a folder, and as I said, it's posted and it's constantly updated as things change because we've talked about how this thing continues to move.
Thank you, Jamie. Carissa?
Yeah, and Jamie, great talking with you.
I
Good
do
luck
have
in
to
your next one.
thank you all.
Jamie.
Yeah. So as you all probably know, the Federation doesn't issue national mandates. We write rules, and what we did issue earlier in the pandemic was a document that offered some suggestions for rules modifications in volleyball. So some of the things that USA Volleyball is doing, like not switching sides, which means not switching benches, limited number of officials, sanitizing equipment, no coin toss, things like that. So they didn't impact the integrity of how the sport's meant to be played so much, but it did give you opportunities to pay attention to COVID-related kinds of mitigation strategies. We will not mandate that state associations or schools even use our rules. State associations have the option of choosing to use them or not, and then implementing their own regulations and bylaws. So what we've seen, though, nationally is that the great majority of our state associations took advantage of those guidelines, and the reports that we've gotten back from those states that actually went all the way through a volleyball season to a state championship of some sort reports are extremely positive, very low incidence of COVID, really not a good understanding, if any, were transmission related to the sport itself. So we say if you can get back to play, you're in California, if you're in a place where the environment's friendly, we've seen some interest in outdoor volleyball, certainly training outdoors if possible, keeping those doors open in the gymnasium, and looking at all the other things that we've talked about earlier to try to keep folks socially distanced and sanitized.
Thank you so much. So we're just out of time. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you to our wonderful participants. While it's a crazy time, we are moving forward together in the safest way possible. Keep an eye out for our follow-up email. I also wanted to note the NFHS has created a winter sports season guide and a fall sports championship guide, which is a consistently updated status document for states across the country on their status for return to play or current rules for play. Chris, I don't know if you wanted to touch on that real quick, or if that's.
Yeah, sure. So on our website, you'll have access to what are essentially national maps that indicate which states are slated to be on time, which are going to modify, which are still unknown. The very weedy details of each state, specific start date for practice, numbers of contests, all of that. We do have that data. It's very organic. We don't post that spreadsheet because it does change from day to day to some degree. So, but if there's a specific question you have about a certain state and some of the details of where they are right now with practice dates and such, just contact us. It would be Cody Porter, who's our point on that data, and that's cporter@nfhs.org. And Cody can help get some specifics of your state or general trends that we're seeing. And certainly the access to the bigger map is there on our website.
Yes. So if you're looking for just in general, we will include the links to both those guides in our follow-up email to this webinar. Also, as we discussed, complying to new safety measures will be costly. Youth sports were already a financial burden for many families, and now costs will become an even greater barrier, both for participants and their families, as well as the leagues. There's going to be an even greater emphasis on physical health and safety on people participating in sports, which will require additional investments in health and safety measures to protect people playing indoor sports. To make physical activity expenses more affordable, to help young athletes get back out on the field or court as soon as possible and as safely as possible, help us make physical activity more affordable. Join us in our efforts to pass the FIT Act, allowing for all physical activity related expenses to be tax deductible and help lower these increased costs. This allows parents, leagues, and facilities to return to play in a safe environment. And we've made things easy for you, allowing you to send a pre-composed email directly to your representatives to voice your support of the FIT Act and encourage them to do the same. We will include the link in our follow-up email, and we hope that you will send a message today. Thank you all so much, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you.
Be well.